Australia might have some of the toughest, coolest cars ever built, but it also produced some of the absolute worst-looking machines to ever disgrace a road. And I'm not talking about a bit ugly. I mean cars that looked confused, mismatched, or like they were approved 5 minutes before the factory closed. Welcome to the 13 ugliest cars ever sold in Australia, starting with the mildly questionable and ending with something so unbelievably wrong it never should have existed in the first place. Let's kick things off with a tragedy of geometry. Imagine a reliable, sensible Camry utterly crushed inside an industrial wool baler. That is the Toyota Rukus. Arriving in 2010, this rolling brick was desperately marketed to hip, urban trendsetters as a radical Gen Y statement piece. Even Toyota's own bewildered executives confessed it was the most un-Toyota vehicle they had ever unleashed. Designed in Los Angeles with a profound, almost violent hostility toward curves, it stood absurdly tall with a glass house the size of a mail slot. Underneath, it was mechanically bulletproof, just a Corolla platform hiding a trusty 2.4-liter Camry engine. But outwardly, it was shaped like a desperately earnest cardboard box that had hallucinated about becoming a delivery van. It silently vanished in 2015, leaving us utterly baffled, completely polarized, and mildly terrified of right angles. How do you spectacularly betray your most fiercely loyal customer base? You rip away the beautifully proportioned European-designed Holden Astra and replace it with this, a rebadged Daewoo wearing the iconic Holden Lion like a shockingly cheap Halloween mask. The 2005 Holden Viva was a masterclass in disappointment. Automotive critics politely called its styling unresolved, which is the industry's secret code for an absolute aesthetic disaster that leaves onlookers deeply unsettled. It utterly lacked the crisp refinement of a true European design. Instead, its lines sagged tragically in the middle, its proportions felt nervously uncertain, and it possessed a face so profoundly forgettable it essentially vanished from your memory while you were staring right at it. Holden loyalists were completely heartbroken. The Viva sold purely on blind brand trust before Holden quietly shuffled it away in absolute disgrace. If you think these first two were bad, you haven't seen anything yet. Stick around, because later in this countdown, we uncover a $700 million corporate bloodbath and a car so utterly catastrophic that its own factory workers threw a massive party when it was finally killed off. Australia has birthed some genuinely legendary kit cars, which makes the Bowwell Ikara a soul-crushing betrayal. Arriving in 1979, this ultra-minimalist fiberglass nightmare was entirely roofless, completely doorless, and looked suspiciously like a giant wedge of cheap cheddar cheese with a lawnmower engine bolted to the back. When pushed out of a shed, its exposed mechanicals gave off a gritty, industrial vibe that might have arguably worked on a dusty racetrack. But out on public roads, mingling with normal traffic on a trip to the local shops, it looked hopelessly lost and deeply confused. While Bowwell deliberately designed it to be cheap, Spartan, and quick in a straight line, there is a massive chasm between minimalist and looking like you simply gave up halfway through the build. Even the three-wheeled Reliant Robin had the decency to include doors. The original Toyota Echo hatchback was a perfectly acceptable, wonderfully sensible little marvel. Then some absolute madman decided it desperately needed a boot, unleashing an act of automotive butchery so brutal it defies belief. The Echo sedan looked exactly like a tall, narrow glass bubble with a hideous rectangular lump violently grafted onto its rear by a frantic team communicating exclusively by fax. The proportions were genuinely terrifying. The roofline plummeted dramatically into a boot that clearly belonged to a completely different, much shorter vehicle. It looked as though the poor car had swallowed an entire suitcase whole and was actively choking on it. It sold purely on the titanium strength of Toyota's legendary reliability. Make no mistake, absolutely nobody in the history of humanity bought this monstrosity for its looks. Not once. It is an aesthetic crime scene. We are just getting started on this descent into automotive hell. Still to come. A car that literally dissolved into rust before its first scheduled service, and the single most spectacular, mind-boggling failure in Australian history waiting for us at number 1. Sometime during the chaotic development of the K13 Micra, a designer stared at a clay model sporting massive bulging headlights and an inflated swooping nose and somehow screamed, "Yes, perfection." It is a decision that still haunts us. Critics notoriously likened its deeply disturbing face to a startled duck-billed platypus, and honestly, they were being incredibly kind. Those gigantic headlights dominated the front end with the wide-eyed, sheer panic of a creature that had just witnessed something utterly horrific and couldn't process the trauma. The comical nose gave it an aura of permanent astonishment, looking like it was perpetually shocked to find itself trapped in morning traffic. While it was intensely practical and undeniably cheap to run, parked next to razor-sharp competitors, the K13 looked like a tragically mutated plastic toy that had taken a desperately wrong turn. The Chrysler Centura's story is a tragedy of epic proportions. The original engineering plan was brilliantly sensible. Shove the massive Hemi 6 engine deep into the bay for perfect balance and add an aggressive, sleek nose. Then ruthless American management violently intervened. They simply stretched the front outward to wrap around the engine where it lazily sat. The horrific result was a spectacularly nose-heavy abomination that journalists mocked as having the gracefulness of a bull in a trotting gig. It nosedived under braking so violently that Chrysler had to install special pressure valves just to stop it from actively killing its drivers. Even worse, striking dockworkers left these French-built bodies rotting on salty wharves for months. They arrived in dealerships already pre-rusted and totally doomed. Every single one of the 19,000 sold was a sheer, terrifying gamble. Think it can't possibly get worse than pre-rusted cars abandoned on a dock? Think again. We are inching dangerously close to a vehicle so unbelievably hideous, rival dealerships secretly filmed training videos just to mock it. Don't you worry, the nightmare is only accelerating. In 1982, the Camira violently kicked down the door, loudly proclaiming itself as Holden's breathtaking, cutting-edge European future. The devastating reality? It was a boxy, tragically unadorned rectangle boasting all the visual passion of a dusty office photocopier. But the true horror lay in its terrifying, almost supernatural commitment to rust. This wasn't subtle corrosion. This was emphatic, passionate, flesh-eating rust. Body panels practically dissolved in thin air with a terrifying speed normally reserved for sunken pirate ships. Disgusting orange bubbles aggressively erupted above the wheel arches within the very first year of ownership, mocking the genuinely ambitious front-wheel drive engineering hidden underneath. Holden aimed for crisp European elegance, but somehow landed on a deeply depressing blank void. Sadly, its technological leaps were completely overshadowed by a body that literally disintegrated before the very first scheduled service. Like a rancid smell carried on a blistering northerly wind, British Leyland spectacularly failed with the Morris Marina. This car was so aggressively uninspired that its own creators refused to speak of it, horrifyingly bolted onto ancient Morris Minor underpinnings, architecture that was already ancient history when the Beatles were just starting out. It hit Australian shores as a rolling fossil. Its utterly depressing styling looked like a desperate sketch drawn by someone who had only ever heard a car described over a crackly radio. The lines drooped tragically. The proportions were a wild, chaotic guess. Quality control was completely fictional. Brand new Marinas were notoriously spotted in showrooms proudly sporting surface rust before a single test drive. Yet, terrifyingly, people actually bought them. It stands as chilling proof that cheap pricing can successfully mask an absolute, undeniable automotive catastrophe. Prepare yourself for a chilling question. How does a vehicle haunt the market for 18 grueling years without earning a single, solitary compliment about its looks? Enter the Mitsubishi Nimbus. This towering, slab-sided punishment had the magnetic visual charm of a bleak municipal utility building and the raw road presence of an oversized beige filing cabinet. It completely lacked the perverse, entertaining charm of spectacular ugliness. It was just aggressively boring. Deliberately designed to be completely featureless, it mindlessly dragged thousands of trapped Australian families to weekend sports and fates for nearly 2 agonizing decades. Passengers stared hopelessly out of its gigantic flat bus windows, silently mourning their tragic life choices. It survived purely on sheer practicality. 18 years, hundreds of thousands sold. The Nimbus proves that true horror isn't always ugly. Sometimes it is just mercilessly, soul-crushingly beige. When motoring journalists compiled 2010's ugliest vehicles, the Holden Barina Spark was mercilessly roasted, described as wearing an alarmed and pained expression and looking violently similar to a mutant duck-billed platypus. The critics were honestly holding back. This cheap Korean Daewoo, embarrassingly disguised behind a desperate Holden badge, exploded onto the scene with hideous bug eyes and a violently protruding snout. It closely resembled a traumatized deep-sea bottom feeder that had been dragged to the surface far too quickly and was screaming in the sunlight. Its miserable 1.2-liter engine churned out barely enough horsepower to survive a flat car park, requiring absolute sheer terror and a heartfelt prayer just to merge onto a highway. Placed next to sleek, sharp rivals, buyers experienced a visceral physical revulsion, actively sprinting past it on the showroom floor to escape its terrifying gaze. Now we are down to the final 3, and the gloves are completely off. You are about to witness a terrifying automotive wedge designed to haul oil drums, a jaw-dropping corporate tragedy, and a number 1 so bizarrely horrific it was literally built by a washing machine company. British Leyland, already an absolute laughingstock, decided to assault Australia with a car so aggressively massive that its primary selling point was fitting a 44-gallon oil drum in the boot, because apparently hauling industrial waste was the suburban dream. The P76 was a catastrophic wedge, seemingly designed by a lunatic screaming dimensions over a terrible phone connection. Its bloated flanks and monstrously slab-like front end looked like a botched, unholy fusion of a brick and a torpedo. Built to Leyland's famously apocalyptic quality standards, the P76 hit the streets instantly, bursting with catastrophic mechanical failures. It was an absolute unmitigated disaster that hemorrhaged money. After just 18,000 agonizing sales across 2 hellish years, the nightmare was finally executed. The incredibly bizarre truth: the factory workers who built it actually threw a massive party to celebrate its death. What does an eye-watering $700 million buy you? A car so catastrophically repulsive it nearly annihilated the Ford Motor Company. The AU Falcon unleashed Ford's new edge design, but the result was a miserable, drooping rear end that looked utterly heartbroken, as if the car was actively weeping. The front featured a horrific waterfall grille that the ruthless press instantly dubbed the paper shredder. But here is the truly scandalous part. Holden secretly filmed a covert training video, ruthlessly weaponizing their entire national sales force to mock the car's tragic looks. By 1999, Ford's panicked president practically begged for forgiveness and rushed emergency changes. But the cruelest, most sickening irony: Underneath that universally despised shell was hidden spectacularly brilliant engineering and an incredibly advanced suspension. But the AU learned a brutal $700 million lesson. In Australia, if your face is hideous, you die. Here we are, the undisputed, terrifying king of Australian automotive horror. A car so profoundly terrible, so fundamentally broken, and so staggeringly ugly, it completely redefines the concept of failure. You have been warned. Let's unveil the absolute worst. At the absolute rock bottom of the barrel sits a true monstrosity built by Harold Lightburn, a man famous for manufacturing cement mixers and washing machines. In 1963, Harold had a fever dream to build a cheap family car. The apocalyptic result was this. Powered by a pathetic 16-horsepower engine, it was a terrifying fiberglass box with virtually nil performance. It lacked a tailgate. You shoved your groceries through the passenger door. It lacked a reverse gear. You had to violently switch the engine off and restart it backwards, just to back up. The bizarre roof fins and tragically tiny wheels made it look like a carnival ride from hell. It was an absolute insult to the concept of motoring. Only 400 poor souls bought one before Harold mercifully retreated back to building washing machines. Pure automotive horror. This episode came to an end. 13 cars, 13 design disasters. Some confusing, some unforgettable, and some just plain wrong. If you made it this far, press subscribe if you want. Thank you for watching and goodbye.